Ah, the Middle Ages, a time of knights, castles, and monsters. Indeed, monsters held a significant role in the physical and imaginative world of that era, showing up in manuscripts, cathedrals, castles, and even medieval chronicles. But these were not mere decorative figures, my friends. They held deep societal meaning, acting as reflective mirrors embodying certain fears, anxieties, and values. From animal hybrids like griffins or unicorns to human beings and animals with birth defects, all were considered monstrous. An infant with birth defects was seen as an omen, a sign of divine displeasure. They were wonders to gawk at, but also sources of immense fear. However, monstrosity was not only about physical characteristics, but extended to behaviors too. In that age, anything deemed taboo was monstrous, and the one involved in such behavior was labeled a monster. These monsters were not just limited to myth and folklore. Real races and cultures were often classified as monstrous due to their different customs, language, and habits. Famous figures like Pliny and St. Augustine of Hippo pondered over these monstrous beings, often leading to theories that justified enslavement and mistreatment of certain races. The rhetoric of monstrosity was further used to demonize groups such as Jews, Muslims, and women deemed a threat by religious and secular authorities. Accusations of monstrous behaviors were heaped upon them, which in turn justified their persecution, segregation, and even massacres. But the real twist in this tale lies, you'll find out soon enough. What's up, my curious and amazing listeners? It's your host, Caesar here, ready to dive into another rabbit hole of fascination. And with me is my insightful partner in crime, Sonia. Are you ready to unravel some mysteries together, Sonia?
Absolutely, Caesar. Hi, everyone.
Excellent. Now, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you won't miss out on our daily episodes. Stay tuned, it's the Curiosity Wonderland, and we're just getting started. Let's dive deeper, folks. In the Middle Ages, monsters were a significant part of not just imagination, but also the physical world. These creatures, marked by excess, deficiency, or hybridity, embodied difference and challenged societal norms by transgressing taboos. Now, when we think of monsters, we might picture vampires, werewolves, or zombies. But in the historical context from antiquity to the 19th century, any creature whose physical appearance deviated from what was considered normal was defined as a monster. Such definitions were not limited to mythical beasts like griffins or unicorns, but even extended to real human beings and animals with physical characteristics we would now consider birth defects.
That's astonishing. So, back then, a person with extra fingers or a missing limb would be termed a monster due to their deviation from the norm. The label of a monster wasn't merely about aesthetics, but held deep societal meanings and repercussions.
Absolutely. In fact, infants with such physical attributes were referred to as monstrous births and were seen as omens or signs of divine displeasure. The fear was so profound that it was not uncommon for these children to be killed or left to die shortly after birth.
It's heartbreaking to think of the fear and misunderstanding these innocent beings must have endured, all because they were born a bit different from the rest. It's a stark reminder of how our understanding and acceptance of differences have evolved over the centuries.
Not just physical attributes, but behaviors were also considered monstrous in ancient and medieval times. This included taboo practices like incest or cannibalism. Anything that deviated from societal norms.
So it's about the otherness, isn't it? The unusual, the different.
Precisely. Even more mundane cultural differences could put a group into the monstrous category. Unusual customs, language, food, clothing. These were all seen as markers of civilization or lack thereof.
So essentially, these definitions of monstrosity were a way for societies to draw lines and define their identities.
Absolutely. They helped philosophers define what it meant to be civilized and what it meant to be human. For instance, there were these so-called monstrous races, believed to inhabit the edges of the world back in the 1st century. Pliny, the Roman author, wrote about 40 races with unusual physical characteristics or habits.
Like a map of the monstrous, right?
Yes, exactly. Pliny included both historical peoples like Ethiopians and Pygmies and more fabulous races.
Like creatures from myths and legends?
Exactly. Creatures like the Cyapodes, who allegedly hopped around on a single leg, or the Cyclopes with only one eye, or the headless Blemier, and even dog-headed people called cynocephali. He was aiming to showcase the diversity of mankind.
A celebration of diversity, in a way, despite the labeling?
Yes, in a sense, though they were classified as monstrous due to their deviation from human norms. And these beliefs were taken quite seriously, even by authoritative figures like St. Augustine of Hippo. Even in the 5th century, St. Augustine pondered the question of whether these monstrous races were human and thus eligible for salvation. He concluded that if these races are rational and mortal, then they are human and can be saved. You know, this reminds me of a recent event where a group of people were ostracized due to their unconventional practices and beliefs. But when you consider them rationally, they were just another group of humans expressing their belief in a different way.
That's rather thought-provoking. It's funny you should mention that, because just the other day, I came across a similar situation. A young man was being criticized for his unusual style of dressing, but when you got to know him, you realized that his dress sense was simply an expression of his unique personality, nothing monstrous about it.
Exactly. It's interesting to see how these ancient concepts of monstrosity have evolved and are still relevant in various forms even today. The rhetoric of monstrosity was often used to demonize groups that were seen as a threat by religious and secular authorities.
And sadly, even today, we often see people being demonized or ostracized because they don't fit into societal norms. It's a stark reminder that we still have a long way to go in terms of acceptance and understanding.
In 11th century Europe, during a time of significant reform, the Catholic Church began singling out certain groups for persecution, often labeling them as harmful or deviant.
And who were these groups?
These groups were diverse, including religious dissidents like Jews and Muslims, as well as Christian heretics. It also targeted other groups like lepers, female prostitutes, and male homosexuals, considering them as deviant or polluting.
So they were essentially marginalizing anyone that didn't fit within their prescribed norms.
Precisely. Accusations against Jews in particular were extreme, including kidnapping, murder, infanticide, and cannibalism. By the 12th century, there were even claims that Jews were ritually murdering Christian children in mockery of the crucifixion.
That's horrific. I can't believe such horrendous accusations were actually made.
Indeed, it's shocking. These charges were used to portray Jews as subhuman monsters and justify violence against them, including forced conversions, segregation, expulsions, and massacres.
And how were the Muslims perceived?
Muslims were seen as a threat to Christendom and defilers of Christian holy places. They were portrayed as violent, cruel, sexually depraved, and polluting. They believed Islam was a false religion, a heresy that not only condemned Muslims but also threatened to infect Christians.
It's distressing to learn that history is marred by such intense animosity and discrimination, all under the guise of safeguarding religion and society.
Just as Jews were represented as monsters, thus fueling anti-Jewish violence, Muslims were depicted similarly to justify violence against them. Jews and Muslims were visually conflated with demons with dark skin, which was associated with sinfulness and the demonic.
When you mention that, it takes me back to my childhood. I remember growing up with various children's books where the villain was always depicted with darker, more ominous features. The villain's lair was always dark and foreboding, while the hero was fair-skinned, and the settings they inhabited were bright and inviting. Even as a child, I could see the stark contrast between the two.
That's a striking parallel. In medieval Europe, there was a specific code for representing demonic, sinful, and non-European bodies. They were portrayed as dark-skinned with deformed or monstrous features, while angelic, saintly, and European bodies were represented as fair-skinned and blonde, with slender, graceful forms.
The depth of this bias is overwhelming. The fact that such imagery was so pervasive in churches and other public spaces of the time only served to strengthen these stereotypes.
Indeed. Demons were distinctly menacing, often torturing humans in scenes of hell or the Last Judgment. They were hybrid creatures with human and animal features, and their skin was typically dark.
It's fascinating and disheartening to see how these stereotypes have been perpetuated throughout history. Even my childhood storybooks followed the same pattern. It really showcases how deeply ingrained these perceptions are in our society.
Demons were seen as real and significantly threatening in medieval Europe, believed to be actively undermining Christians by tempting them into sin or doubt.
It sounds like these demons were the most feared monsters of the time.
Absolutely they were, and this fear was reinforced by the visual depiction of Muslims and Jews with similar features, thus declaring them as not fully human and demonically inspired monsters.
And all this was geared toward undermining non-Christian societies.
Exactly. It's also worth noting that another group that was demonized during this period was women. The 11th century Reform movement, which aimed at imposing celibacy on the Christian clergy in Western Europe, led to an intensification of misogynistic rhetoric. Women were portrayed as dangerous sources of moral and sexual pollution.
It seems as if the rhetoric used against women was even more virulent than usual.
That's correct. According to the medical theories of the time, women were considered monstrous because they were seen as deficient or unfinished men, and their bodily functions were viewed as polluting and poisonous.
It's quite alarming how these old prejudices have shaped societies across eras. We still see remnants of these biases even today.
While Christianity improved the status of women in some ways, many medieval Christian theologians still held a dim view of women. They were seen primarily as sources of temptation, best to be avoided.
This can be traced back to the story of Adam and Eve, right?
Exactly. Eve, though the mother of humanity, was widely blamed for mankind's fall from grace. She succumbed to temptation in the Garden of Eden and led Adam astray. Most theologians and reformers overlooked the fact that Eve herself was a victim of Satan's deceit and largely placed the blame for mankind's fall on her.
So medieval depictions always put Eve in a bad light.
Yes, and they even went as far as asserting that all women shared Eve's guilt. Women were portrayed as obstacles to men's salvation, often seen as deceptive sirens controlled by their sexual desires. This excessive sexuality marked them as monstrous, going beyond the bounds of social acceptability.
It's intriguing how these ancient narratives have shaped society's perception of women, even till this day.
Indeed it is. Even celibate nuns were not spared. Renowned monks like Bernard of Clairvaux and Abelard argued that they could potentially lead men astray. So anyone who valued their immortal soul was advised to avoid them.
It's disheartening to see how deeply ingrained these prejudices were. It underscores the importance of understanding history, as it helps us see the roots of many of our present-day issues.
We've traveled through time today, all the way back to medieval Europe, and seen how the concept of monsters has been used to dehumanize and ostracize certain groups. These societal outliers, whether human beings with physical abnormalities or entire communities with differing beliefs, were portrayed as monsters, seen as threats to established norms.
That's right. It was a journey that showed us the power of societal fears and prejudices, and how they can be used to define and devalue the other. Monsters were not always mythical creatures, but often real people who didn't fit into the accepted norms of society.
And if we think about it, isn't it a monstrous act itself to label someone else as a monster just because they're different?
That's some food for thought. Well, if you enjoyed this episode of Curiosity Wonderland, make sure to blast that like button. If you have any thoughts on this topic, don't hesitate to comment below. And please share this episode with your friends. It's a fascinating subject that deserves a wider audience.
Indeed, it's been a great discussion. Remember, monsters are only as real as we make them. So let's strive for a world with fewer monsters and more empathy.
Beautifully put. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope to catch you all in the next episode of Curiosity Wonderland. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone, and remember to stay curious. Today's insightful discussion was inspired by the article How to Make a Monster by Charity Urbanski, published on medievalists.net on October 23, 2023. If you'd like to delve deeper, the full link is in the video description. Now I'm off. Stay curious.